Well, today, partners, we're getting creative with leather. We wrangle an inspiring story out of saddle maker Will Ghormley. He invites us into his studio here in the heart of the city and shows us what it takes to tool leather.
Michele Beschen's Courage to Create with Michele Beschen. And on today's show, special guest, Will Ghormley.
His heart may be out on the range, but we found him right here in the heart of the city. A true cowboy who has grabbed his artistic side by the reins and carved a name for himself in the leather industry. Meet the maker, Will Ghormley.
Leatherwork is kind of a family tradition between my dad's hobby with leather, and my mom was a photo colorist. Growing up with leather and the smell of oil paint and turpentine, I didn't have much of a chance what I became eventually. Most everything I learned the hard way through trial and error. When it comes to doing what you love to do and doing it for a living, it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, what you love to do becomes work. On the other hand, work is the stuff you love to do. Leather is such a fantastic medium. I mean, it's so versatile, so forgiving. It's used for so many different things. It's just amazing. And the cowboy aspect to leatherwork is a fairly dominant aspect of it in the United States, but by no means is it all-inclusive. Unless I'm getting paid really well, I stick with cowboy stuff, because that's where my niche in the market is cowboy gear, specifically Old West cowboy gear. That in and of itself is very satisfying, to do the research and to know that you're creating something that with a little age and use could be mistaken for being 100 years old. I love history, and it's a real satisfying way to share that love of history in a tangible way with other people. Now, the nice thing about doing stuff that isn't original is I can just get really creative with it. I'm motivated by a reaction. I want to get a specific reaction out of the end user, whether it's that is the most beautiful picture I've ever seen, or whether it's a saddle, as I'm building the saddle and carving the ground seat to fit that part of a cowboy that's going to be spending the most time there. You know, I take into account what it's going to take to make that a comfortable seat. So at the end of the day, he can get off and walk his horse to hay or to water, or walk to the truck, and not, you know, just kind of crumple. Before I ever built saddles, I worked as a cowboy. And it was working as a cowboy in the fall roundups where I got my appreciation for a good saddle. I've actually timed myself, and like this saddle right here, just the basic saddle, was about 42 hours.
Are there a lot of leather artists out there?
There's more of them than you'd think, but it is dying out. I mean, it's something that's not getting passed on. And
why is that, do you think?
it's time-consuming, tedious. There's a lot to learn. It takes a long time to get really good at it. So it's not the McDonald's instant gratification type thing that everybody's come to want out of life. You've probably noticed that this car fad seems to be hanging on, so there's not that many not much of a need for saddle makers anymore. Teaching is real important because it's being lost. Really, for the future of the industry, it's important that, somewhere along the line, kids are impressed with something you can make out of leather, just like I was when I was a boy. I would have to say, when it comes down to people, I inspire me. Knowing what my potential is. I'm inspired by challenges. When I create something, it always starts out as a vision. I have to take everything that's in my heart and everything that's in my mind, and it has to come out through my fingertips. It's one of the most fulfilling and satisfying things in the world. I believe people are inherently creative at some level. And I think everybody has a need to create, whether it's creating a show or creating the perfect lighting for the show,
Yeah.
or creating a saddle that you can put 20 miles in and still walk. You know, that's the creativity that's essential in the expression of every human being. It just comes out in different ways for different people.
Yep.
I need to make myself a new coat for this winter because the old one's falling apart. But I have a couple other goals that I have yet to achieve. One would be to write a best-selling historical novel, or even just write a really poor historical novel, just for myself, just because I have stories in me that need to be told. And the other would be to ride one of my saddles in a movie as like an extra. You know, ideally it would be a good movie, historically correct movie.
But before Will sets out for Hollywood, we've lassoed him in for a lesson. A little leatherworking 101 coming up next.
I'm going down to the river. I'm gonna shake and shiver. I'm gonna roll in the water. I'm gonna take your daughter.
Okay, well, I'm going to warn you, I haven't really done much with leather. And I've dabbled in a lot of different things, so, but I'm quite confident you can kind of show us the way here.
Leathercraft 101.
All right, walk us through.
Okay. Well, whenever you're going to tool leather, and that's specifically what I'm going to deal
Okay.
with. Tooling is a generic term that simply talks about applying any type of tool to the surface
Okay.
of the leather to make a mark. But mostly what I use is a vegetable tanned tooling leather.
Okay.
You don't want to try and make boots out of it because it's too heavy and stiff. And the first thing you want to do when you're going to tool leather is get it damp. This is leather that I wetted yesterday and it sat overnight. I just ran a little water on both sides, just enough that the surface was wet, and then I put it in, wrapped it up in saran wrap. So the water is thoroughly soaked through the entire length of the piece of leather, and it's spread out evenly throughout the leather, so you don't have real wet spots and real
Okay.
dry spots. What happens when you dampen leather is the fibers swell up with moisture, and then when you put an imprint on them, you drive that moisture out, and basically you're enabling the leather to take a deep and permanent imprint.
Because see, we're going from this to this, and there are many, many steps in between.
The first tool we're going to actually use to make an imprint on the leather is going to be the swivel knife. And it's probably one of the most difficult tools to master, but it can give you the widest range of effects.
Okay.
The first cuts you want to do are the border cuts. And then you start with the most important element and work your way out. Ideally, you want to hold the blade so it's straight up and down, and then tip it back away from you so you're drawing it through the leather.
Okay.
The first impression tool we're going to use is the Camouflager, and we'll use that both laying it flat where it is flush on the leather, and also at an angle where we'll just get the heel of it.
Okay.
Next is going to be the Pear Shader. Well, what it does is it adds contour to the flat surface of the leather. There's kind of a rhythm, and you'll have to hear what I'm talking about. You just have to tap and drag is what it amounts to.
And there's not a quicker way to get from that to that, huh?
Well, you can take the
Not
shortcut.
one big stamp.
Actually,
That take all the fun out of it.
they do have big embossing machines that do that very thing, and but then it's not hand tooled either.
Right. Now we're on to beveling.
Now we need to bevel. When you're beveling, the first area you want to bevel is along the border line, And what you're doing basically is you're going along these lines we've cut into the surface of the leather, and you're forcing one side down. It makes it recessed, and it makes the other area seem to stick up. Okay, next step is the veiner. It's called a veiner because it simulates the veins in flowering plants. The veiner is tipped on edge so that it leaves a deep impression along the center cut, and then fades out the further it gets away. And we'll move on to the cedar.
Okay.
The cedar represents seeds, oddly enough. So after the cedar, we use the backgrounder.
All right.
The backgrounder is for the background, obviously, and it just creates a texture in the background, and it also forces it to a lower.
So your flower comes forward a little bit more.
Brings by depressing the background, you bring the flower to the foreground. You want inconsistency, basically, in the background. You don't want to form a pattern. We get to move on to the stops. And what it does is it brings the cuts you have that come into the interior, it brings them to a finality.
All right.
The stops are followed up by one of my favorite tools, which is the mule's foot. What it does is it accents the closure of the line, as well as filling up some of the empty space of the stock. You don't necessarily have to follow these specific steps in this order, but I would say, as a general rule, this gives the best results.
Okay.
Because some of the tools have to overlap other tools. And that is the end of the stamping tools.
Okay.
The last.
My arms wore out good.
You're
a lot
lucky.
of hammering involved in this project.
You're lucky we're using the little hammer.
Yeah.
Now the next step is perhaps the most difficult, and it adds one of the nicest elements to the finished piece, and that is the decorative cuts.
Okay.
One of the things that's going to help you most on the decorative cut is to, before you start moving the knife, embed it in the leather. And if you think about it as two separate functions, embedding and then slicing, you'll get a better decorative cut.
Okay.
And I think that is done.
That is beautiful. I have a much greater appreciation for this when I see it now. That takes a lot of time and a lot of steps and a lot of tools along the way, but it is cool. Now what are we going to do with it?
Well, you're going to take
Make
it
something
home
out
and,
of it? And turn it into a belt buckle.